Section 21 of Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 4, by Agnes and Elizabeth Strickland. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anne Boulay. Catherine Howard, Chapter 1, Part 2. It is impossible to ascertain the date of Catherine's first appearance at court, but it has been generally said that she made a conquest of her sovereign at a banquet given by the Bishop of Winchester to his royal master a few months after his marriage with Anne of Cleves. When Gardiner observed the impression made by the charms and sprightly wit of the fair niece of his patron, the Duke of Norfolk, he contrived that the king should have frequent opportunities of seeing her at his house. Catherine was exquisitely graceful in her manners and deportment, but so remarkably small, that Richard Hill, in a contemporary letter, in which he details the news of the court to his friend Bullinger, says, "The king is going to part with the queen, that he may be married to Mrs. Howard, a very little girl." Hill describes Catherine also as a young person, the niece of the Duke of Norfolk, and specifies midsummer as the time when it began to be whispered that the king was much taken with her, that they had met several times at the house of Gardiner, and that scandal was already busy on the subject of the fickle monarch's passion for the miniature beauty in her teens. The date of Catherine Howard's appointment as maid of honor to Anne of Cleves is uncertain, but it probably took place at the time when the queen was deprived of her foreign attendants, and the strange maidens were superseded by some of the noble belles of Henry's court. The arrangement that added the new object of the sovereign's regard to the establishment of his despised consort was of course of his own ordaining, as it afforded him the gratification of her society in his own royal circle, as well as in his more private hours of relaxation, and thus we see him, for the third time, the avowed lover of a favourite maid of honour. How far his addresses were encouraged by the youthful beauty is not known. She seems to have behaved with greater propriety than either Anne Boleyn or Jane Seymour under similar circumstances, for no one has accused her of treating the queen with disrespect, or presuming to assume airs of state in rivalry to her. It has been very generally asserted, but on what grounds no one has specified, that Catherine permitted herself to be rendered a political puppet in the hands of Gardiner and her uncle Norfolk, to further their measures against the cause of the Reformation, and that Cromwell, dreading the effects of her influence, spake of her in very disadvantageous terms to the king, in order to dissuade him from making her his queen. There is great probability in this statement, but that Cromwell's death was attributable to the ill offices of the offended beauty requires proof, for there is not the slightest contemporary evidence, not so much as a private letter, to bear out the assertions of Burnet and Rapin, that she prevailed on the king to sign the death warrant of his fallen minister. Catherine Howard neither possessed the talents, the energy, nor the vindictive temper of her cousin, Anne Boleyn. Her intrigues were not those of state policy. And as for her subserviency to her uncle Norfolk's wishes, his letters to the king are a sufficient refutation of that report. After Catherine's removal to court, Durham vanished so entirely from the scene that no one knew whether he was living or dead. This was an auspicious circumstance for Catherine, but her grandmother, whose share of wisdom was certainly small, could not control the absurd curiosity which prompted her to inquire of her domestics if any of them knew what had become of Francis Durham. They replied, that none of them knew. "Then," said the duchess, "if any one knows where he is, belike it will be Catherine Howard." Soon after these inquiries, Catherine, who was then one of the maidens of the court, came to pay her grandmother a visit, and the old lady was guilty of the folly of reviving his apparently forgotten name, by asking her, if she knew where he was? Catherine replied, that she did not know where he was become. Some years had passed away since the guilt was incurred which had cast so dark a cloud over the hopes and expectations of that period of existence which is generally the golden age of life. Those years had probably been fraught with repentance and bitter regret for her fault, and if they had not led to amendment of life, which charity would lead us to hope, The change in her deportment was so decided that she was remarkable for her maidenly and modest behavior, which, as Henry afterwards declared, formed her greatest attraction in his sight. Marillac, in a letter to Francis I, dated the 21st of July, thus speaks of the reports connected with Henry's engagement to Catherine. Now it is said that the king is going to marry a lady of great beauty, daughter to a deceased brother of the Duke of Norfolk. It is even said that the marriage has already taken place, but is kept secret. I cannot tell how far it is true. In a letter to the Constable Montmorency of the same date, he adds, that he has heard the lady is not only married to the king, but likely to bring him a family. The old Duchess of Norfolk took infinite pains to secure the royal alliance for her fair young protégée. She bestowed costly array and jewels on her to enhance her native attractions, and it is said that she instructed her in what manner to demean herself to the king's highness so as to please him. She was even guilty of the folly of commending Catherine to the king as a person worthy of the honor of becoming his wife and one calculated to promote his happiness. If Catherine had flattered herself with the idea that because so many years had passed away since her early misconduct had occurred, that it was forgotten, she must have been undeceived when she received the following letter from one of her former unprincipled confidants, the person through whose assistance she had carried on a clandestine and forbidden correspondence with her seducer. Joan Bulmer to Catherine Howard. If I could wish unto you all the honor, wealth, and good fortune you could desire, you would neither lack health, wealth, long life, nor yet prosperity. Nevertheless, seeing I cannot, as I would, express this unto you, I would with these my most heartily salutations pite you to know, that whereas it hath been shown unto me that God of his high goodness hath put unto the knowledge of the king a contract of matrimony that the queen hath made with another before she came into England, and thereupon there will be a lawful divorce had between them, and as it is thought that the king of his goodness will put you in the same honor that she was in, which no doubt you be worthy to have, most heartily desiring you to have in your remembrance the unfeigned love that my heart hath always borne towards you, which for the same kindness found in you again hath desired always your presence, if it might be so, above all other creatures, and the chance of fortune that hath brought me, on the contrary, into the utmost misery of the world and most wretched life. Seeing no ways, then, I can express in writing, knowing no remedy out of it without you, of your goodness, will find the means to get me to London, which will be very hard to do. But if you write unto my husband, and command him to bring me up, which I think he dare not disobey, for if it might be, I would fain be with you before you were in your honor, and in the mean season I beseech you to save some room for me, what you shall think fit for yourself, for the nearer I were to you, the gladder I would be of it, what pains soever I did take. I would write more unto you, but I dare not be so bold, for considering the great honor you are toward, it did not become me to put myself in presence, but the remembrance of the perfect honesty that I have always known to be in you, and the report of Sir John Seaford, which hath assured me that the same thing remains in you still, hath encouraged me to this. Whereupon I beseech you not to be forgetful of this my request, for if you do not help me, I am not like to have worldly joys, desiring you, if you can, to let me have some answer of this for the satisfying of my mind, for I know the Queen of Britain will not forget her secretary, and favor you will show. Your humble servant, with heart unfeigned, Joan Bulmer. York, the 12th day of July. The letter of Joan Bulmer was only the foretaste of what Catherine had to expect as the fruits of her early follies. No sooner was the rumor of the king's divorce from his new queen, combined with the report of his passion for her, spread abroad, than she found herself beset with those persons whom, of all the world, it was most to her interest to have kept at a distance. The evil spirits who had departed from her for a season returned to harass and intimidate her with demands which she wanted the moral courage to withstand. In fact, she had no power to extricate herself from these perils and degrading connections, unless she had revealed her former misconduct to the king. But even if Catherine had been permitted by her family to make such a disclosure to her royal lover, she was placed in a predicament that left her only the alternative of becoming a queen or confessing her own shame. She chose the first. Durham, meantime, through long Perdue, was not ignorant of the king's passion for his betrothed, for in allusion to it, he said to one of his former comrades, "I could be sure of Mistress Howard, and I would, but I dare not. The king beginneth to love her, but an he were dead, I am sure I might marry her." This speech leads to the conclusion that he was induced to waive his prior claim to the fair object of his sovereign's choice, and it is more than probable that the old Duchess of Norfolk was the person who prevailed upon him to remain quiescent, and if so, this would account for the otherwise inscrutable mystery of that lady's conduct in tolerating his presence, and even allowing him to take up his abode in her house a second time after his misconduct with the young Catherine. The public announcement of the dissolution of Henry's marriage with Anne of Cleves was followed by a petition from his servile parliament, beseeching him, for the good of his people, to venture on a fifth marriage, in the hope that God would bless him with a more numerous issue. The nuptials of the royal Bluebeard of English history with Catherine Howard were privately solemnized within a few days, or it might be a few hours, after he was released from his marriage vows to Anne of Cleves. Some persons, as for instance Marillac, the French ambassador, supposed he did not wait for that ceremony. It seems strange that no particulars of the solemnization of Henry's fifth marriage have ever been brought to light. The day, the hour, the witnesses, and the person by whom the nuptial benediction was pronounced are not on record. But on the 8th of August, 1540, Catherine Howard was introduced by Henry at Hampton Court as his queen. On that day she took her seat at chapel in the royal closet by Henry's side. She afterwards dined in public, on which occasion she placed her youngest stepdaughter, the Princess Elizabeth, opposite to herself at table, and always gave her the place of honor next to her own person, because she was the daughter of her cousin, Anne Boleyn. On the 15th of August, Catherine was publicly prayed for throughout the realm as Queen of England. This is particularly noticed by Marillac, who says, "The king, the queen, and the child Edward, Prince of England, were prayed for in all the churches, the new queen's name having superseded that of the repudiated Princess of Cleves." No surprise is testified by any contemporary at this alliance as derogatory to the king. A close connection already existed between the royal family and Catherine's, in consequence of the former marriage between her uncle, the present Duke of Norfolk, when Lord Thomas Howard, with the king's aunt, the Lady Anne Plantagenet. As Catherine Howard was first cousin to Henry's second wife, Anne Boleyn, their marriage required a dispensation from the Pope, both parties being Catholic. But Henry, in his new character of head of the Church, thought proper to dispense with this ceremony. This marriage was the first ever contracted between persons so connected, without previously obtaining the papal sanction, and it formed the precedent for all others. Henry had taken care to prepare for the legality of the contract by a previous act of Parliament concerning marriages within certain degrees, which bore upon the case. A few days after Henry had acknowledged Catherine for his queen, he conducted her to Windsor, where they remained till the 22nd of August. They then made a little progress to Reading, Eulham, Rycott, Notley, Buckingham, and Grafton. At Grafton, the royal bride and bridegroom sojourned from August 29th till September 7th. The absence of all records of pageantry and processions would indicate that the enamored monarch had been desirous of enjoying the society of his young queen in the retirement of the country, unfettered by the observations and restraints of royal etiquette. Henry's finances at this period were at a low ebb. The expenses of his pompous nuptials with his unbeloved Flemish bride and his subsequent gifts and settlements on her had completely exhausted all his resources. He could neither afford to honor Catherine Howard with a public bridal nor a coronation, but he paid her the compliment of causing gold coins to be struck in commemoration of their marriage, bearing the royal arms of England, flanked with HR and surmounted with the royal diadem. On the reverse is a rose, crowned, in allusion to his bride, flanked by the initials K.R., with the following legend: Henricus opt, rutilans rosa sine spina. The rose, which Henry, in the first transports of his short-lived passion for his Howard queen, chose for her symbol, makes a conspicuous figure in the augmentation which he granted to her armorial bearings in honor of her marriage. Among the unedited manuscripts in the State Paper Office, we find a list of the officers of state and ladies of Queen Catherine Howard's royal household. The ladies were those of the highest rank in the kingdom, and some of them members of the royal family. The great ladies of the Queen's household. The Lady Margaret Douglas, niece to the King. The Duchess of Richmond, daughter-in-law to the King and cousin to the Queen. The Duchess of Norfolk, Catherine Willoughby, fourth wife to Charles Brandon, the King's brother-in-law. The Countess of Sussex, the Lady Howard, the Lady Clinton. Ladies of the Privy Chamber. The Countess of Rutland, the Lady Rochford, Lady Edgecombe, Lady Baynton. Gentlewomen of the Privy Chamber. Mrs. Herbert, Mrs. Tyrwhitt, Mrs. Lee, Mrs. Gilman. Chamberers. Mrs. Tilney, Mrs. Morton, Mrs. Fryswith, Mrs. Lufkin. Ladies and gentlewomen attendant. The Lady Dudley, Lady Arundel, the Queen's sister. Lady Dennis, Lady Wriothesley, Lady Heneage, Lady Knevet, Lady Cromwell, sister to the deceased Queen Jane Seymour. Mrs. Mewtas, Mrs. Broughton. Maids of honor. The Lady Lucy, Mrs. Bassett, Mrs. Garnish, Mrs. Calpladike, Mrs. Stradling, Mrs. Strawner. A list of yeoman ushers, yeomen of the chambers in ordinary, pages of the chambers, and pages in ordinary follows. The names of the officers of the household are not of any particular interest. Her chaplains were Doctors Mollett and Oglethorpe. The latter held the office of almoner to her predecessor, Anne of Cleves. Sir Thomas Denys was her chancellor at first, but afterwards superseded by her sister's husband, Sir Thomas Arundel. The historians of this period bear universal testimony to the passionate fondness of the king for his new consort. Marillac, the French ambassador, who had enjoyed the opportunity of paying his compliments to the royal pair on their marriage, gives the following lively sketch of Catherine's appearance in her bridal court and Henry's demeanour to her, in a letter to his own sovereign, Francis I, dated September 3, 1540. The new queen is a young lady of moderate beauty, but superlative grace. In stature she is small and slender. Her countenance is very delightful, of which the king is so greatly enamored, that he knows not how to make sufficient demonstrations of his affection for her, and very far exceeds the caresses he ever bestowed on the others. She is dressed after the French fashion, like all the other ladies of the court, and bears for her device round her arms, Non altre volonté, que le sienne. No other will than his. The expression beauté médiocre, which is used by Marillac in reference to this queen, would seem to infer that Catherine was not so remarkable for her personal charms as she has been represented by historians, but independently of the acknowledged fact that opinions vary greatly on the subject of female loveliness, Marillac might only mean to qualify his first notice of Catherine when speaking of her from report, in which he says, "The king is going to marry a young lady of the greatest beauty." Marillac's royal master, Francis I, having been much harassed with Henry's requisitions for him to provide him with a consort endowed with perfections such as are seldom to be found in mortal woman, had probably demanded of his accredited spy at the court of England an accurate description of the lady whom his queen-killing friend considered worthy the honor of becoming his next victim. The only authentic portrait of the Howard queen that we have seen is an original outline sketch of her among the Holbein heads in the Royal Library at Windsor. She is there represented as a fair blooming girl in her teens, with large laughing blue eyes and light brown hair, which is folded in Madonna bands on either side of a brow of childlike simplicity. She has a nose retroussé and very full red lips. It is the countenance of an unintelligent little romp trying to assume an air of dignity, and reminds us of a good-humored Flemish peasant rather than a courtly beauty and a queen. Instead of the slender graceful proportions described by Marillac, she is so plump and round that she appears literally bursting out of her tight bodice, which is made very high and fits closely to her shape. It opens a little in front, and is fastened with a small round brooch. Her headdress, which is very formal and unbecoming for so young a person, is a small French hood, sitting quite flat to the head with a narrow plaited border. It is possible that Holbein's sketch of Catherine Howard was taken some months after her elevation to the throne, when she might have acquired a considerable degree of embonpoint. If the charms of royalty and power had lulled the young queen into forgetfulness of the precarious tenure on which these perilous distinctions were held by Henry's wives, she was full soon reminded that the sword was suspended over her own head by a single hair. In the first months of her marriage, mysterious reports in her disparagement were in circulation, for on the 28th of August, the attention of the Privy Council was called to the fact that a certain priest at Windsor was accused, with others of his company, of having spoken unbefitting words of the Queen's grace, for which he and another person had been apprehended. The priest was committed to the custody of Wriothesley, the king's secretary, and the other incarcerated in the keep of Windsor Castle. How alarming any investigation of scandals that might lead to the discovery of those passages in her early life which had been detailed in the preceding pages of this memoir must have been to this queen may be imagined. With such a secret as she had on her mind, her diadem could have poorly compensated her for the agonizing apprehensions under which she must have writhed while the examinations were pending. Henry, being in the first intoxication of his bridal happiness, passed the matter lightly over. The priest was simply enjoined to confine himself to his own diocese, and admonished by his majesty's command to be more temperate in the use of his tongue. But the person from whom he had heard the unbefitting words of the queen, which had been unguardedly repeated by him, was confined till further order. It was in all probability this affair that afforded her enemies the first clue to Catherine's early errors, though the cloud passed over for a time. If she had been of a vindictive temper, a severer penalty might have been paid by those who had thus maligned her within the verge of her own court, and measures would have been taken to silence every tongue that ventured to disparage her. After a short sojourn in the silver bowers of Grafton, the court removed to Ampthill. While there, the royal household appears to have required reform, for we find that Robert Tyrwhitt, Esquire, the vice-chamberlain to the king, and Sir Edward Baynton, knight, the queen's vice-chamberlain, and divers other gentlemen the king and queen's servants, to the number of 16, were advertised of the king's pleasure concerning the sober and temperate order that his highness would have them to use in his highness's chamber of presence, and also the queen's, as also the behaviour of themselves toward the king's privy council, gentlemen of the privy chamber, and all other his highness's servants of every degree. Catherine could have had little control over such of her attendants as had pertinaciously attached themselves to her fortune. Joan Bulmer was one of her bedchamber women, so also was Catherine Tilney, a person only too well acquainted with her former misconduct, and worst of all, the profligate villain Manox was in her service as one of the royal musicians. At Ampthill, the king and queen remained till the 1st of October, after which they withdrew to the greater seclusion of Moor Park, in Hertfordshire, and while there, Henry, being impatient of the slightest interruption or intrusion, issued the following gracious orders, through his privy council, that Queen Catherine's vice-chamberlain and his own, and all the officers of the royal household, that from henceforth they should in no wise molest his royal person with any suit or petition, but cause all suits or supplications to be made in writing and delivered to his council. The court returned to Windsor October 22nd. At this period reports were in circulation that Henry was about to dismiss Catherine and reinstate Anne of Cleves in her place, for the repudiated queen was likely to become a mother at a very unseasonable juncture for all parties. Marillac, whom no particle of gossip seems to escape, thus notices these rumors. It is false what has been said about the king leaving the new queen. to take the one whom he has repudiated, for he bestows so many caresses on her he now has, with such singular demonstrations of affection that it cannot be. That which caused the report was, that it has been said the other lady was pregnant, but she has been indisposed. In his next letter to Francis I, dated November 1st, he says, "It is believed that the new queen has entirely gained the favor of the king, and of her, who was lately queen, they spake no more than if she were dead." Catherine held her court at Windsor rather better than a month. The acts of the Privy Council of November 23 specify that the king and the queen, accompanied only by the Lord Privy Seal, the Lord Admiral, the Master of the Horse, and the Vice Chamberlain of the Privy Council, and the ladies, gentlemen, and gentlewomen of their Privy Chamber, departed for Oking, where they remained until the 7th of December, upon which day his Highness, with the Queen's grace, departed to Oatlands, and there remained till the 18th of the same month, and upon that day came to Hampton Court. Henry VIII, in his journeys and removals, was on former occasions attended by his council, but here he dispenses with their presence, that he may spend his Christmas at Hampton Court, in the society of Queen Catherine, without the interruption of business or the restraints of royal pomp. The first separation, after a marriage of 6 months, that had occurred between the king and queen, took place February 7, 1541, when the king, for the dispatch of business, removed to London, with his personal attendants, only leaving behind him at Hampton Court the Queen's grace, with the whole household. He returned again the 10th day. No sort of pomp or regal splendor distinguished the court of the young and beautiful Howard queen. We find no records of her indulging her love of dress in the purchase of costly robes or jewelry, nor of gifts bestowed on her kindred or favorites. So quiet and unostentatious was the tenor of her life at this period, that the only matter worthy of notice during her residence at Hampton Court is the order to her tailor, dated March 1st, to provide the following needful articles for the use of the venerable Countess of Salisbury, at that time an attainted prisoner in the Tower of London, under sentence of death, and despoiled of all her substance. In premise, a nightgown furred, a kirtle worsted, and a petticoat furred. Item, another gown of the fashion of a nightgown, of say lined with satin of Cyprus, and faced with satin. Item, a bonnet and a frontlet. Item, 4 pair of hose. Item, 4 pair of shoes and 1 pair of slips, probably slippers. The warm clothing provided for her by Queen Catherine was probably the means of preserving the venerable princess to undergo a fate scarcely less dreadful than that of perishing with cold in her cheerless prison lodgings. Catherine's dower was settled on her by the king's letters patent, previous to the Easter festival, and other grants, licenses, and concessions are secured to her by the same instruments. The whole of the spring and part of the summer were spent by Henry and Catherine in domestic retirement at the country palaces of Greenwich and Eltham, or in making progresses through Kent, Essex, and the Midland counties. If we are to give credit to the assertions, unsupported by proofs, of the majority of historians, Catherine had remained under the political guidance of her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, and Gardiner, Bishop of Winchester, but as her influence with the king increased, she grew impatient of the tutelage of her uncle, who certainly did not possess the art of conciliating the affections of the ladies of his family, since he was at open variance with his wife, his sister, his daughter, and his stepmother, the Duchess Dowager of Norfolk. It might be that Catherine took part in the quarrel between him and the last named lady, with whom she was certainly on terms of the greatest confidence. But from whatever cause their disagreement arose, it was highly imprudent of the queen, who was naturally an object of jealousy and distrust to the Protestant party, to deprive herself of the protection and support of her powerful kinsman. The event afforded a striking exemplification of the divine proverb, that a house divided against itself cannot stand. Catherine, in the pride of youth and beauty, and blinded by her boundless influence over the mind of a royal husband, forgot, perhaps, that the throne to which his capricious passion had exalted her was based on the graves of 3 of her predecessors, and that it was only too likely to prove in her own case, as in that of Anne Boleyn, a splendid ascent to a scaffold, She imagined that while she was all-powerful with Henry, she might defy the rest of the world. The whole realm was then split into two great parties, so nicely matched as to strength and numbers, that the ruling balance was in the hand of the sovereign, to dispose according to his own pleasure. It was that power which rendered Henry VIII a despotic monarch, and enabled him to trample on the boasted laws and liberties of Englishmen with impunity. Catholics and Protestants had succumbed alike to his evil passions, and endeavoured to use them as political weapons in their struggles with each other for mastery. The contest had commenced when Henry's divorce from Catherine of Aragon was first agitated, and the Protestant party supported the interests of Anne Boleyn. 5 years had passed away since these rival queens had vanished from the arena, and yet the names of Anne and Catherine were still the watchwords of the warring parties, for Henry was again the husband of two living wives of those names, and the legality of his divorce from the Protestant queen Anne, and his marriage with the Catholic Catherine, was almost as much questioned by his Protestant subjects as his divorce from Catherine of Aragon and his marriage with Anne Boleyn had been by the Catholics. Thus we see that Catherine Howard was regarded by the Reformed party in much the same light as Anne Boleyn had formerly been by the Catholics. It was fondly imagined by such of the former, who regarded Anne of Cleves as Henry's lawful queen, that he might be won to a reconciliation with her, if he could be convinced of the unworthiness of her fair successor to fill her place. That the Duke of Cleves was so persuaded, we have shown in the preceding memoir, and it is a fact that throws some light on the diplomatic tact with which the political leaders of that party had organized their plans for the downfall of Catherine Howard. The early follies of Catherine were known to too many not to have reached the persons most interested in destroying her influence with the king, and if they delayed striking the blow that was to lay her honors in the dust, it was only to render it more effectual. The snake was to be killed, not scorched. A crisis at length arrived, which afforded a favorable opportunity for carrying the project into execution. There was a Catholic insurrection in Yorkshire this spring, headed by Sir John Neville. Henry, attributing this to the influence of Cardinal Pole, gave orders for the execution of the venerable Countess of Salisbury, his mother, who had lain under sentence of death in the Tower for upwards of a 12-month. Her sentence had been basely and illegally procured by Cromwell just before his own arrest for treason. His execution, and probably the influence of the new queen, had thus long delayed the headsman's axe from descending on the guiltless victim. She was the last of the Plantagenets, and, with a spirit not unworthy of her mighty ancestors, refused to submit to any unjust sentence by laying her head upon the block. "So should traitors do," she said, "but I am none, and if you will have my head, you must win it as you can." A scene of horror followed, which was concluded by the ruffian minister of Henry's vengeance, dragging the aged princess by her hoary hair to the block, where he slovenly butchered her, and stained the scaffold from veins enriched with the royal blood of England. Henry's mistrust of the Catholic party, in consequence of the late insurrection, induced him to leave administration of affairs in the hands of an anti-papal council headed by Cranmer, Audley the Lord Chancellor, and Seymour Earl of Hertford, the brother of the late Queen Jane, when he proceeded on his journey into Yorkshire. Queen Catherine was the companion of his journey. They left London early in July, passed some days in the palace at Grafton, and so travelled through Northampton and Lincolnshire to York. The progress was attended with some degrees of splendour, but more of terror. Henry was received by his subjects on the road as a destroying angel, ready to inflict the vengeance of heaven on the counties implicated in the late revolt. As the best propitiation they could devise, the men of Lincolnshire offered him money in all the towns through which he passed with his fair young queen. Probably he would not have been appeased without blood also, if she who possessed the art of charming fury passions had not been at his side. In Yorkshire, the king and queen were met by 200 gentlemen of the shire, in coats of velvet, with 4,000 tall yeomen and serving men, who on their knees made a submission by the mouth of Sir Robert Bowes, and gave the king £900. Catherine witnessed a pageant of no less interest, when the Archbishop of York, with upwards of 300 ecclesiastics in their attendance, met the king on Barnesdale, and made a like submission with a peace offering of 600 pounds. Like submission was made by the mayors of York, of Newcastle, and of Hull, each of whom gave the king 100 pounds. In the course of their progress, Catherine held a court at her dower manor of Shire, which, in memory of that circumstance, is still called Queen's Hold. It was during this fatal progress that Catherine, when at Pontefract Castle, sealed her own doom by admitting her former paramour, Francis Derham, into her household, as a gentleman in waiting and private secretary to herself. Sharon Turner, following Lord Herbert and some other writers, says that Derham was only employed on 2 or 3 occasions in the absence of the Queen's secretary to write her private letters. When we reflect on the nature of some of the letters the unfortunate Catherine was in the habit of receiving, we may readily suppose she preferred the dreadful alternative of employing Derham as her amanuensis rather than a person unacquainted with her fatal secret. It is a doubtful point whether the mysteries of writing, and consequently of reading letters, were among the accomplishments of this ill-fated queen. Joan Bulmer's epistle, previous to the royal marriage, claims Catherine's grateful remembrance, on the grounds of having exercised her clerkly skill in her service when but a private gentlewoman, and it is certain that no letter written by Catherine can be found. Even her signature has been vainly sought at the State Paper Office and elsewhere. The Duchess of Norfolk has been accused of having introduced Derham herself into her granddaughter's court. It is possible that this was the case, since neither of these unhappy ladies had the moral courage to put a stern negative on his audacious demand of preferment if he insisted upon it. Catherine had been married upwards of 12 months before this appointment was granted, the date of which, according to Holinshed, was the 27th of August. On the 29th of the same month, her cousin, Thomas Culpeper, had a long private interview with her at Lincoln, in her closet, or privy chamber, at 11 at night, no one being present but Lady Rochford, her principal lady in waiting, by whom he was introduced. The conference lasted many hours, and at his departure the queen presented him with a chain and a rich cap. This secret meeting, and the unseasonable time at which it took place, was afterwards construed into a proof of a criminal intimacy between the queen and her kinsman. But if Catherine had really been engaged in an intrigue with this near relation, she would scarcely have hazarded bringing him and Derham in contact, knowing, as she did, the jealous temper and lawless character of her seducer. Culpeper was one of the gentlemen of the king's privy chamber, and, in all probability, terrified at the peril in which the queen was involving herself by the appointment of Derham to an office in her household, sought and obtained a private audience for the purpose of remonstrating with her on the subject. This was, in fact, the part that every faithful kinsman would have taken, if aware of the nature of the previous connection between her and Derham. The king and queen arrived at York about the 14th of September, and tarried there 12 days. Great preparations had been made for the reception of Henry's nephew, James V of Scotland, but that prince, placing no reliance on his uncle's principles, excused himself from accepting his invitation to meet him there. Henry and Catherine quitted York September 26th, and that night they supped and slept at home, an ancient moated mansion, which had been recently forfeited to the crown by the rebellion of Sir Robert Constable. On the 1st of October they reached Hull, where they remained 5 days, and crossing the Humber, they pursued their homeward route through Lincolnshire. In one of the letters from the council with the king to that in London, Mr. Secretary Wriothesley writes, "The king and queen and all the train be merry and in health." In the course of this progress, Catherine enjoyed more of the pomp and pageantry of royalty than had fallen to her lot since her marriage with the king. The truth was, they travelled at the expense of the wealthy aristocracy of those counties which, having been recently involved in rebellion, omitted nothing that was likely to conciliate the offended sovereign. Henry, who had become every day more enamored of his beautiful young queen, took great delight in displaying her to his people in his public entrances into the principal towns in their route, and omitted nothing that was likely to give her pleasure. Catherine, being of a plastic age and temper, readily adapted herself to his humor, and made it her study to amuse and cheer him when he came to her fatigued and harassed with the cares of state. The increase of her influence during this progress was beheld with jealous feelings by those who were naturally desirous of destroying her credit with the king, and the circumstance of the royal travellers resting one night at the house of Sir John Gorswick, who had, during the preceding spring, denounced Cranmer in open parliament as the root of all heresies, was sufficiently alarming to that primate. There was, moreover, a select meeting of the Privy Council, at which Gardiner presided, held at Gorswick's house, affording strong confirmation to the assertions of Burnet and Rapin that Cranmer had reason to believe that he should very shortly follow Cromwell to the scaffold, unless some means were found of averting the gathering storm. At this momentous crisis, the Archbishop communicated to his colleagues, the Earl of Hertford and the Lord Chancellor, the particulars of the Queen's early misconduct in the house of the Duchess of Norfolk, which had been conveyed to him by John Lascelles, brother of the vile woman who had connived at the indiscretions, and finally the guilt of the unhappy girl. This disclosure was stated to have taken place in a conversation between Lascelles and his sister, in consequence of his advising her to ask for a place in the Queen's household, as others had done, to which Mary replied, that she did not wish to enter into the service of the Queen, but that she pitied her. Why so? asked Lascelles. Mary, replied the other, because she is light both in conditions and living, and then she related the tale of Catherine's lapse from virtue with Durham in revolting terms. Alas, for the motherless child who had in the most perilous season of woman's life been exposed to the contaminating society of such a female. The disclosure was regarded by the Earl of Hertford and the Lord Chancellor as a matter proper to be laid before the king, and the task was deputed to Cranmer. End of section 21. Section 22 of Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 4, by Agnes and Elizabeth Strickland. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anne Boulay. Catherine Howard, Chapter 2, Part 1. The Queen, unconscious of how dark a cloud impended over her, was receiving fresh tokens of regard every hour from Henry, who behaved as if it were his intentions to prove to the world how much the wife was dearer than the bride. They arrived at Windsor on the 26th of October, and proceeded to Hampton Court on the 30th, in readiness to keep the festival of All Saints. Henry and Catherine both received the sacrament that day. Henry, on this occasion, while kneeling before the altar, raised his eyes to heaven and exclaimed aloud, I render thanks to thee, O Lord, that after so many strange accidents that have befallen my marriages, thou hast been pleased to give me a wife so entirely conformed to my inclinations as her that I now have. He then requested his confessor, the Bishop of Lincoln, to prepare a public form of thanksgiving to Almighty God for having blessed him with so loving, dutiful, and virtuous a queen. This was to be read on the morrow, which was All Souls' Day. But on that fatal morrow, while Henry was at mass, the paper that contained the particulars of the misconduct of her whom he esteemed such a jewel of womanhood and perfect love to himself, was put into his hands by Cranmer, with a humble request that he would read it when he was in entire privacy. The object of Cranmer in presenting the information against the Queen to Henry in the chapel was evidently to prevent the announcement to the people of the public form of thanksgiving which had been prepared by the bishop. The absence of Catherine from her accustomed place in the royal closet afforded the archbishop the better opportunity of striking this decisive blow. Henry at first treated the statement as a calumny invented for the destruction of the Queen, for, as he himself afterwards declared, he so tenderly loved the woman, and had conceived such a constant opinion of her honesty, that he supposed it rather to be a forged matter than the truth. On which, being greatly perplexed, he sent for the Lord Privy Seal, the Lord Admiral, Sir Anthony Brown, and Sir Thomas Wriothesley, to whom he opened the case, saying, at the same time, he could not believe it to be true, and yet, the information having been once made, He could not be satisfied till the certainty thereof were known, but he would not in any wise that in the Inquisition any spark of scandal should arise against the queen. He then dispatched the Lord Privy Seal to London, where Lascelles was secretly kept, to try if he would stand to his saying. Lascelles reiterated his tale and added, that he would rather die in the declaration of the truth, since it so nearly touched the king, than live with the concealment of the same. His sister was also examined, who gave evidence of the early misconduct of the queen. That Catherine had admitted Durham and Manox, with John Bulmer and other persons who were acquainted with her fatal misconduct, into her royal household, was probably a matter in which she had no choice, as she was entirely in their power, but the circumstance of their being there afforded a startling confirmation of the charges against her. Wriothesley received express instructions from the king to take Durham into custody on an accusation of piracy, because he had been before in Ireland, formerly noted for that offence, making that pretense lest any spark of suspicion should get abroad from his examination. The arrest was effected, and Henry's wrathful jealousy having been powerfully excited by a report that the old Duchess of Norfolk should have the folly to say, when in the queen's chamber, to a certain gentlewoman, "There," pointing to Durham, "this is he who fled away into Ireland for the queen's sake," caused him to be examined very sharply as to the nature of his connection with the queen. Durham boldly acknowledged that a promise of marriage had been exchanged between himself and the queen many years previous to her union with the king, that they had lived as man and wife while he was in the service of her grandmother, the Duchess of Norfolk, and that they were regarded in that light among the servants in the family, that he was accustomed to call her wife, and that she had often called him husband, before witnesses, that they had exchanged gifts and love tokens frequently in these days, and he had given her money whenever he had it. He solemnly denied that the slightest familiarity had ever taken place between them since Catherine's marriage with the king. This was the substance of his first statements, freely given, nor could the extremity of torture wring from him anything of further import against the queen. Neither is there the slightest evidence tending to convict her of having renewed her criminal intimacy with him. On the contrary, it would appear by the bitter scorn of her expressions, when compelled to name him, that he had become the object of her greatest aversion, after she had seen the folly of her early infatuation, and felt the blight that his selfish passion had been the means of casting on her morning bloom of life. When the result of the first day's investigation was brought to the king by the persons employed in that business, he seemed like a man pierced to the heart, and, after vainly struggling for utterance, his pride and firmness gave way, and he burst into a passion of tears. He left Hampton Court the next morning without seeing the queen, or sending any message to her, and the same day the council came to her in a body and informed her of the charge that had been made against her. She denied it, with earnest protestations of her innocence, but the moment they were gone, fell into fits so violent that her life and reason were that night supposed to be in danger. When this was reported to the king, he sent Cranmer to her in the morning with a deceitful assurance that if she would acknowledge her transgressions, the king, although her life had been forfeited by the law, had determined to extend unto her his most gracious mercy. Catherine, who was in a state of frantic agony when the archbishop entered, was overpowered with softer emotions on hearing the message, and unable to do more than raise her hands with expressions of thankfulness to the king for having shown her more mercy than she had dared to ask for herself. In the evening Cranmer returned to her again, when, finding her more composed, he drew from her a promise that she would reply to his questions as truthfully and faithfully as she would answer at the day of judgment, on the promise which she made at her baptism, and by the sacrament which she received on All Hallows Day last past. The particulars of the queen's behaviour during these interviews, and the agonizing state of excitement in which she was at this dreadful crisis of her fate, will be best detailed in the following letter from Cranmer to the king. Cranmer to Henry VIII. It may please your majesty to understand that, at the repair to the queen's grace, I found her in such lamentation and heaviness as I never saw no creature, so that it would have pitied any man's heart in the world to have looked upon her. And in that vehement rage she continued, as they informed me which be about her, from my departure from her unto my return again, and then I found her, as I do suppose, far entered towards a frenzy, which I feared, before my departure from her, at my first being with her. Surely, if your grace's comfort had not come in time, she could have continued no long time in that condition without a frenzy, which, nevertheless, I do yet much suspect to follow hereafter. As for my message from your majesty unto her, I was purposed to enter communication in this wise. First, to exaggerate the grievousness of her demerits, then to declare unto her the justice of your grace's laws, and that she ought to suffer by the same, and last of all, to signify unto her your most gracious mercy. But when I saw in what condition she was, I was fain to turn my purpose, and to begin at the last part first, to comfort her by your grace's benignity and mercy. For else the recital of your grace's laws, with the aggravation of her offences, might, peradventure, have driven her into some dangerous ecstasy, or else into a very frenzy, so that the words of comfort, coming last, might have come too late. And after I had declared your grace's mercy extended unto her, she held up her hands, and gave most humble thanks unto your majesty, who had showed her more grace and mercy than she herself thought meet to sue for, or could have hoped for. Then, for a time, she became more temperate and moderate, saving that she still sobbed and wept. But after a little pausing, she suddenly fell into a new rage, much worse than before. Now I do use her thus. When I do see her in any such extreme braze, I do travail with her to know the cause, and then, as much as I can, I do labor to take away, or at the least, to mitigate the cause, and so I did at that time. I told her there was some new fantasy come into her head, which I desired to open unto me. And after a certain time, when she had recovered herself, that she might speak, she cried and said, Alas, my lord, that I am alive! The fear of death did not grieve me so much, before as doth now the remembrance of the king's goodness. For when I remember how gracious and loving a prince I had, I cannot but sorrow. But this sudden mercy, more than I could have looked for, showed unto me, so unworthy at this time, maketh mine offences to appear before mine eyes, much more heinous than they did before. And the more I consider the greatness of his mercy, the more I do sorrow in my heart that I should so misorder myself against his majesty. And for all I could say to her, she continued in a great pang a long while. After that she began something to remit her rage, and come to herself. She was meetly well unto night, and I had good communication with her, and, as I thought, brought her into a great quietness. Nevertheless, at night, about 6 of the clock, she fell into another pang, but not so outrageous as the first, and that was, as she showed me, because of remembrance that, at the time of the evening, as she said, Master Heneage was wont to bring her news of your grace. And because I lacked time to write all things to your majesty, I have referred other things to be opened by the mouth of the bearer of this, Sir John Dudley, saving I have sent enclosed all that I can get of her, concerning any communication with Durham, which, although it be not so much as I thought, yet, I suppose, is surely sufficient to prove a contract, although she thinks it be no contract. The cause that Master Baynton was sent to your majesty was, partly for the declaration of her state, and partly because, after my departure from her, she began to excuse and tamper those things which she had spoken unto me, and set her hand, as, at my coming unto your majesty, I shall more fully declare by word of mouth, for she saith, that Durham used to her importune force, and had not her free will and consent. Thus, Almighty God have your majesty in his preservation and governance. From your grace's most bounded chaplain, T. Canturin. From Cranmer's assertion that the queen had set her hand to the paper, it has been inferred that she was able to write, but it might be only her mark of attestation. And even if she could sign her name, it does not prove her capability of writing letters or anything beyond a signature. In the whole of this transaction there is nothing more extraordinary than the perversity of Catherine in refusing to acknowledge that, as far as an obligation, which had not received the sanction of the church, could go, she was plighted to her kinsman, Francis Durham, before she received the nuptial ring from King Henry. But with the same headstrong rashness which had characterized her conduct from childhood, she determined to cling to her queenly dignity at all hazards, rather than admit any plea that would have the effect of rendering her subsequent marriage with the king null and void. The following passages are subjoined on that point from her confession, which was sent by Cranmer to the king. Being again examined by my lord of Canterbury of contracts and communications of marriage between Durham and me, I shall here answer faithfully and truly, as I shall make answer at the last day of judgment, and by the promise that I made in baptism, and the sacrament I received upon All Hallows Day last past. First, I do say that Durham hath many times moved me unto the question of matrimony, whereunto, as far as I remember, I never granted him more than I have confessed. And as for those words, I do promise that I love you with all my heart. I do not remember that I ever spoke them. But as concerning the other words, that I should promise him by my faith and troth, I am sure I never spoke them. Questioned whether I called him husband and he me wife, I do answer that there was communication in the house that we two should marry together, and some of his enemies had envy thereat, wherefore he desired me to give him leave to call me wife, and that I would call him husband, and I said I was content, and so, after that, commonly he called me wife, and many times I called him husband, and he used many times to kiss me. And I suppose this is true, that at one time he kissed me very often. Some who stood by made observations on his conduct, whereunto he answered, who should hinder him from kissing his own wife? King Henry remained in the neighboring palace of Oatlands, whither he had withdrawn to await the result of these investigations. He appears to have been torn with contending passions, and not venturing to trust his own feelings with regard to his unhappy queen, he left all proceedings to the direction of Cranmer and the council. Catherine was now placed under arrest, and her keys were taken away from her, and on the 11th of October, the Archbishop of Canterbury, with Wriothesley and Mr. Comptroller, received orders to go to the queen and signify to her the king's pleasure that she should depart on the following Monday to Sion House, while the inquiry pended. The state of a queen was not entirely taken from her, but reduced to the following appointments, which are copied from the order in council. The furniture of 3 chambers, hanged with mean stuff, without any cloth of a state canopy, of which 3, one shall serve for Mr. Baynton and the others to dine in, and the other 2 to serve for her use, and with a small number of servants. The king's highness's pleasure is that the queen have, according to her choice, 4 gentlewomen and 2 chamberers, foreseeing always that my lady Baynton be one, whose husband the king's pleasure is, should attend the queen, and have the rule and government of the whole house. Besides Mr. Baynton, his wife and the almoner, the king appointeth none specially, to remain with her. The rest are to depart upon Monday next. And the king's pleasure is, that my lady Mary be conducted to my lord prince's house by Sir John Dudley, with a convenient number of Queen Catherine's servants. Lady Margaret Douglas, the daughter of Henry's sister, the Queen of Scotland, had likewise to make way for the disgraced queen's establishment. She was conducted to Kenning Hall, and with her went the young Duchess of Richmond. The queen's maids of honor were ordered to return to their friends, excepting Mrs. Bassett, whom the king, considering the calamity of her friends, determined to provide for. Then, following the king's resolution to lay before the Parliament and judges the abominable behaviour of the queen, but without any mention of the pre-contract to Durham, which might serve for her defence, but only to open and make manifest the king's highness's just cause of indignation and displeasure. Considering that no man would think it reasonable that the king's highness, although his majesty doth not yet take the degree of her estate utterly from her, should entertain her so tenderly in the high degree and estate of a queen, who, for her demerits, is so unworthy of the same. Therefore the king's majesty willeth, that whoever among you know not only the whole matter, but also how it was first detected, by whom and by what means, it came to the king's majesty's knowledge, with the whole of the king's majesty's sorrowful behaviour and careful proceeding in it, should upon the Sunday coming assemble all the ladies and gentlewomen and gentlemen being now in the queen's household, and declare unto them the whole process of the matter, except that ye make no mention of the precontract, but omitting that, set forth such matter as might conform their misdemeanour. Touching the queen's departing from that house and removing to Sion, shall be on Monday next coming, such ladies only to remain at Hampton Court to abide the queen's removing, as by advertisement from you, of those that shall succeed there, providing always that the ladies keep their day of departure upon Monday, and such only to remain at Hampton Court to abide the queen's removing, as shall be attendant at Sion, giving you, Mr. Comptroller, to understand that Mr. Weldon, master of the household, hath been here spoken to make provision of wine, beer, and other necessaries at Sion for that purpose, at the King's Palace of Westminster, the 11th of November at night. Your loving friends, Norfolk, Southampton, Suffolk, Russell, Anton Brown, Anthony Wingfield, Ralph Saddler. Furthermore, his majesty's pleasure is, that Mr. Seymour shall remain there, with all the jewels and other things of the queen's, till she be gone, and then to bring them hither. And to the queen's grace, ye must appoint 6 French hoods, with the appurtenances, with edges of goldsmith's work, so there be no stone or pearl in the same, likewise as many pairs of sleeves, 6 gowns, and 6 kirtles of silk damask and velvet, with such things as belong to the same, except always stone and pearl. At the court, Westminster, to my lord of Canterbury at Hampton Court. In parts of this order we trace the lingering tenderness of the king for her who had been so lately the object of his adoring fondness. It is also curious to observe how those who at first raked up the most trivial gossips' tales that 8 years ago circulated among the menials of the Duchess of Norfolk in order to establish the fact of a precontract between Durham and the queen, now caution their colleagues by no means to mention the precontract, lest it should serve her for an excuse to save her life. The council had, in fact, come to the determination of proceeding against the queen on the awful charge of adultery, and, finding it impossible to convict her of that crime with Durham, they determined to fix it on some other person. But so circumspect had been the deportment of Catherine since her marriage, that the only man to whom she had ever manifested the slightest degree of condescension was her first cousin, Thomas Culpeper. This young gentleman was the son of Catherine's uncle, Sir John Culpeper, of Hollingbourne in Kent. He was a gentleman of the privy chamber to Henry VIII, before the elevation of his fair kinswoman to the fatal dignity of queen consort. His name is found among the royal appointments at the marriage of Anne of Cleves, and he distinguished himself in the jousts at Durham House in honour of those nuptials. In the 33rd year of King Henry, he obtained the grant of 3 manors from the crown. The nearness of their relationship naturally caused great intimacy between him and Catherine, for they had been companions in childhood. But whether there was ever a matrimonial engagement in perspective between them, as suspected by her forsaken and jealous lover, Durham, previous to her union with the king, cannot be ascertained. It is possible that such a report might have decided the council to implicate him with the queen in a charge of adultery. As this was the only means of dissolving the king's marriage, the queen's female attendants were strictly examined with a view to establish the charge. Whether these unfortunate women were examined by torture, like the men, or only put in terror of it, is not on record. But when we remember that Wriothesley and Rich were the agents by whom the evidences were collected, it may be supposed they were not very scrupulous as to the means they employed. These were the men afterwards found superseding the more merciful executioner in his abhorred office in the dungeon of the young, the lovely, and pious Anne Askew, when, provoked by her silent fortitude, they threw off their gowns and worked the rack with their own ferocious hands, till they nearly tore her delicate frame asunder. These 2 men were the most unprincipled and sanguinary of the whole swarm of parvenus of whom Henry's cabinet was composed. Wriothesley is thus portrayed by a contemporary poet: from vile estate of base and low degree, by false deceit, by craft and subtle ways, of mischief mold and key of cruelty, was crept full high, borne up by various stays. With ireful eye, or glaring like a cat, killing by spite whom he thought fit to hit. It is impossible to read Wriothesley's reports of the examinations of the witnesses without perceiving his deadly malice against the queen and her kindred. When writing to his colleague Sadler, he does not disguise his satisfaction at piking out anything that is likely to serve the purpose of our business, as he calls it. I assure you, writes he, my woman Tilney hath done us worthy service and true, as it appeareth. The evidence on which Mr. Secretary Wriothesley felicitates himself so highly goes no farther than to prove that the queen was surrounded by spies who were disposed to place evil constructions on her most trifling departure from the rigor of royal etiquette. The following is the document alluded to. The deposition of Catherine Tilney at Westminster, November 13th, 33 Henry VIII. She saith that she remembers at Lincoln the queen went 2 nights out of her chamber when it was late to Lady Rochford's chamber, which was up a little pair of stairs by the queen's chamber. And the first night this deponent and Margaret, her colleague, went up with her, and the queen made them both go down again, but Margaret went up again eftsoons, and this deponent went to bed with Mrs. Frithswith, another of the queen's chamberers. As far as she remembereth, when it was late, about 2 of the clock, Margaret came up to the bed to them, and she, Tilney, said to Margaret, Jesus, is not the queen abed yet? And Margaret said, Yes, even now. The second night she says that the queen made all her fellows go to bed, and took only this deponent with her, at which time she tarried also in manner, as long as she did the other night, during which time this deponent was in a little place with my Lady Rochford's woman. And therefore on her peril saith, she never saw who came unto the queen and my Lady Rochford, nor heard what was said between them. Item, she saith, that the queen hath caused her to do sundry such strange messages to Lady Rochford, that she could not tell her how to utter them, and at Hampton Court lately she bade her go to my Lady Rochford and ask her, when she should have the thing she promised her? And she, Lady Rochford, answered, that she sat up for it, and she would the next day bring her word herself. A like message and answer was conveyed to and from my lord of Suffolk. It is of course impossible to penetrate into the secret of these mysterious messages, but considering that the king's brother-in-law, Suffolk, was one of the parties concerned, it is impossible to imagine they were any way connected with love affairs, and therefore the probability is they related to supplies of money, or the private purchase of jewels or articles of adornment, which the queen employed the agency of these persons to procure in an underhand way. Catherine, like all persons who have been early initiated into the dark mysteries of sin, had evidently acquired a systematic habit of concealment, even with regard to those trifling actions which, when openly performed, would never excite suspicion. The testimony of Margaret Morton, Tilney's companion, is unfavorable to the queen, as far as her own opinion goes. She imagined that the Lady Rochford was a party to some intrigue that the queen was carrying on at Lincoln, Pontefract, and York. When they were at Pontefract, she says, that the queen had angry words with Mrs. Lufkin, another of the chamberers, and herself, and forbade their attendance in her bedchamber. On which these 2 ladies kept a jealous watch on her majesty's proceedings. Lady Rochford, Margaret said, conveyed letters to and from the queen to Culpeper, as it was supposed, and one night when they were at Pontefract, and the queen was in her bedchamber, with no other attendant than my Lady Rochford, and the Lady Rochford, which was an unusual thing, did not only lock the chamber door, but bolted it in the inside also, and when the king came with the intent to pass the night there, he found the door so fastened, and there was some delay before he was admitted. It is possible, however, that the queen was in the bath, or so engaged as to render it expedient to fasten her chamber door, for there is no evidence to prove that any other person was in the chamber besides the lady-in-waiting and the queen. The fate of Anne Boleyn and her brother, Lord Rochford, had recently afforded melancholy witness on how slight grounds a queen of England might be sent to the block, and a noble gentleman done to death by slanderous tongues. The only evidence adduced in proof of the alleged crime of Anne Boleyn with her brother was, that he had leaned his hand on her bed, and now his widow, who had borne murderous testimony against her lord, was to be brought by retributive justice to an ignominious death, on the charge of having been an accomplice in a royal intrigue, because she, as lady in waiting, had been present at an interview between the queen and her first cousin. Lady Rochford was many years older than her thoughtless mistress, and, having been lady of the bedchamber to the 4 preceding queens, she ought to have had sufficient experience in the etiquette of the court to have warned Catherine of the impropriety of admitting her kinsman to her presence at an unsuitable hour. How greatly Catherine's health was shaken by the agitating scenes of that dreadful week may be gathered from a letter from Sir Ralph Sadler, directing the Archbishop and Wriothesley to question the queen again with respect to her intimacy with Culpeper, if they found her in such a state of health and mind as to bear it. Nothing could induce Catherine to admit that there had ever been the slightest impropriety between her and this near relative. None of the great ladies in attendance on the queen were examined. Margaret Douglas, the king's niece, who was the first lady in waiting, however, received a severe reprimand, not for being privy to any levity on the part of the queen, but for her own misconduct in having entered into a clandestine courtship with Lord Charles Howard, who was at the same time the young uncle of the queen, and also the half-brother of her first love, the unfortunate Lord Thomas Howard, who died imprisoned in the Tower, for having presumed to plight his troth without the king's consent to a lady in such near relation to the crown. End of section 22. Section 23 of Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 4, by Agnes and Elizabeth Strickland. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anne Boulay. Catherine Howard, Chapter 2, Part 2. On the 13th of November, Catherine was removed as a degraded prisoner from Hampton Court to Sion. Her disgrace was proclaimed to her attendants, who were assembled in the Star Chamber for that purpose, and the household was discharged. Though many of the Queen's ladies were, as we have seen, of the highest rank, the Lord Chancellor entered into all the details in his declaration of Catherine's former misconduct with Durham. He concluded with an intimation that there was a still further appearance of abomination in the Queen, which for the present he left in a cloud. The very next day Henry's ministers, who were in great haste to proclaim the dishonor of their royal master to foreign nations, addressed a circular announcing the whole order and story of the Queen's misconduct to the king's ministers abroad. They even obliged the French ambassador with particulars which ought never to have been made public, even if true. Francis I, in return, sent his condolences to Henry on the misbehavior of Catherine Howard, saying, he was sorry to hear of the great displeasures, troubles, and inquietations which his good brother had recently had by the naughty demeanour of her lately reputed for queen. The motives of Henry's council in thus blazoning the charges against the queen as facts, before they had been substantiated as such by a trial, are glaringly apparent. There was a strong yearning in the king's heart towards her, therefore the chance existed of her regaining her former influence, since no actual evidence could be brought of her disloyalty to him, and, in the event of a reconciliation, those who had accused Catherine would have cause to apprehend punishment for conspiring against her life and fame. They played their perilous game with too much skill to allow the bruised reed to rise again, and before the first transport of Henry's indignation had subsided sufficiently to admit of his forming a dispassionate judgment of the nature of his wrong. For to be wrought with what we love doth work like madness on the brain. They struck a master stroke of policy by inducing him to sanction the publication of details which would prevent the possibility of his ever receiving Catherine again as his queen. In the meantime, information was conveyed to the council that the Duchess of Norfolk, on hearing the rumor of the arrest of the queen and Durham, has secretly dispatched a confidential servant named Pewson to Hampton Court to ascertain the real state of the case. Pewson, on his return, told his lady that it was reported that the queen had misconducted herself with Durham, and that Catherine Tilney was privy to her guilt. The Duchess said she could not think it was true, but if it were, all three deserved to be hanged. She then said to Derham's friend Damport, "I hear Mr. Derham is taken, and also the Queen. What is the matter?" "Some words belike spoken by him to the gentleman usher," was the reply. The Duchess expressed great alarm lest anything should befall the Queen in consequence of evil reports. She gave Damport £10, doubtless to purchase his silence, and it seems she had been accustomed to allow him an annual stipend. The Duke of Norfolk was dispatched, by order of the king, to make search at the Duchess's house at Lambeth for Derham's papers and effects. Before his arrival, however, the old Duchess, with the assistance of the yeomen of her kitchen and some others of her menus, had broken open the coffers and trunks belonging to Derham, and carried off, and, as it is supposed, destroyed, everything that was likely to be brought in evidence against herself or any of the parties implicated in the knowledge of the Queen's early transgressions. When the Duke reported what had been done by his stepmother, she and all her servants were placed under arrest, and very strictly examined by the council. The following is the account given of the examination of one of the delinquents. First we began with Ashby, the Duchess of Norfolk's man, and wrote on Sunday 3 or 4 leaves of paper, where, among many long tales of small importance, he said that when the Duchess broke up Derham's coffers, he, Ashby, and her comptroller, a priest, were present, besides the smith, who picked the one coffer and broke open the other. The Duchess took out all the writings and carried them to her chamber, saying she would peruse them at her leisure, without suffering any person to be present. The like she did also with such writings as were in his mail. She declared she meant not any of these things to come to revelation. She would have had Ashby take a satin coat belonging to Derham in the place of 30s. 8d, which Derham owed him, but he refused it. He confessed also that the Duchess had been in the greatest fear lest Alice Wilkes should have told Lord William of the familiarity between the Queen and Derham. She would have sent one to Calais to have informed the Lord William Howard of this matter if she had not been advised to the contrary. He, Ashby, confessed that she, the Duchess, once said, that if there be no offence since the marriage, she, the Queen, ought not to die for what was done before, and also that she demanded whether the pardon would not serve other persons who knew of their naughty life before the marriage. Also he confessed that she broke open a chest and 2 coffers of Damport's, after he was committed to the Tower, and likewise took out all his writings and letters at this breaking also. Ashby and her comptroller were present, and one Dunn, yeoman of her cellar, who played the smith's part. On a second and third examination of the persons concerned in this transaction, nothing further could be learned than that the Duchess found several bundles of papers, some ballads, and books with musical notes for playing on the lute, among Derham's effects. How his trunks and personal property came to be in the Duchess of Norfolk's house can only be accounted for on the supposition that his office at court did not entitle him to lodgings in the palace, that he was only there in rotation with other gentlemen in waiting, and that his general home was in the house of his noble kinswoman, the Duchess of Norfolk. Who his parents were is unknown, yet he always had the command of money, as we find by his costly presents to Catherine when she was living as a dependent in the house of the Duchess. Derham, on being cross-questioned on Catherine Tilney's evidence, touching the Duchess of Norfolk's knowledge of his clandestine courtship of the Queen when a girl, admitted the fact, that the Duchess had once seen him kiss her granddaughter, for which she struck him and beat her, and gave Bulmer a blow for permitting it, as related before. Many times also, he said, she would blame him and Catherine. He said that he was introduced into the royal household by the Queen's desire, who told the Duchess of Norfolk to bring him. How far this was fact cannot be ascertained, but all the evidences agree that he was introduced into the palace by the Duchess of Norfolk. Lady Howard deposed that being in the court, the Queen once asked her where Derham was, and she replied, "He is here with my lord," and the Queen said, "My Lady of Norfolk hath desired me to be good unto him." Be this how it might, The circumstance of his being in the household had the worst possible effect on the queen's cause. Moreover, it was the only available fact against her, and was used by the council as presumptive evidence that it was her intention to wrong the king. Henry naturally regarded it in that light. Mr. Secretary Wriothesley gives a lively account of the terror of the Duchess of Norfolk and her resistance to the royal mandate, when he brought the order for her arrest. The recent butchery of the aged Countess of Salisbury of course rendered such a proceeding sufficiently alarming. The Duchess immediately fell very ill, and said she was not well enough to be removed. On which Wriothesley tells the council that he and the Earl of Southampton and Mr. Pollard went to see her, the better to perceive whether she were indeed as sick as she pretended. At first, says he, we entered as though we had only come to visit and comfort her, whereby we perceived in short space that she was not so sick as she made for, but able enough to repair to my lord chancellor as his highness appointed. Then began we to tell her that my lord chancellor had certain questions to demand of her, which should much serve to the clearing of the matter, and so advised her to repair to him, saying the matters were not long, ne such as we thought she would not both shortly and truly answer. But here she began to be very sick again, even at the heart, as she said, which was the sickness of mistrust, that if she went she would not return again. Nevertheless, with much ado, we got her to condescend to her going, and so we departed, to the intent that she should mistrust no false measure, and we all stayed at the house of me, Sir Thomas Wriothesley, till we saw her barge pass. We have also travelled this day with Pewson, whom we have in custody, but he is yet stiff. Marry, he confesseth already his going to Hampton Court after Derham's apprehension, but the purport of his going to those parts was to buy boards for my lady of Norfolk, and faggots for himself at Kingston, as he saith. But we think he can, and shall tell another tale, wherein, as all the rest, we shall travail to the best of our powers to get out the truth. Sir, we pray you to send hither all examinations as you have touching these matters, that we may peruse them, and pick all such things out of them as may serve to the purpose of our business. Catherine had now the bitter agony of learning that her aged relative was not only involved in her disgrace, but was sick and in prison, and in peril of being brought to a death of ignominy for having concealed her light conduct. We twain, write Southampton and Wriothesley, went to the Tower, and then first began with my lady of Norfolk, whom we found on her bed as it appeared very sickly. Pressing her as much as we might to declare some further matter and knowledge touching the misconduct of the Queen and Derham, assuring her on his Majesty's behalf of her own life, if she would in some sort make us her ghostly confessors, she made us answer, that she would take her death of it, that she never suspected any wrong between them. She took God to witness that she never thought them to be of that abominable sort she now knoweth them to be of. Nevertheless, she will not deny that she perceived a sort of light love and favour between them more than between indifferent persons, and had heard that Derham would sundry times give her, Catherine Howard, money, which she thought proceeded from the affection that groweth of kindred, the same Derham being her kinsman. But in that she told not his majesty thereof before his marriage, and in that she brake Derham and Damport's coffers, she confesseth to have offended God and his majesty, and beseecheth his majesty most humbly therefore, in his most noble heart to forgive her, and to be her good and gracious lord as he hath been, for otherwise her days would not be long. We assure you she appeareth wondrous sorrowful, repentant, and sickly. Queen Catherine and her grandmother were both at this period sick nearly unto death with grief and terror, and in their separate prisons they were assailed with subtle interrogatories day after day by the pitiless members of King Henry's council, of which the purport was to outrage all the ties of nature by rendering them witnesses against each other. Some of the questions put to the unhappy queen bore no reference to her alleged offences, but are standing proofs of the insolent curiosity of those by whom she was examined. She was even asked what change of apparel the Duchess was wont to give her yearly, when under her care, with other questions of the most irrelevant and trivial nature. No evidence proving the crime of adultery against the queen could be extorted from the Duchess of Norfolk or any other witness. On the 31st of November, Culpeper and Durham were arraigned for high treason in Guildhall before the Lord Mayor, contrary to any previous form of law. Justice was out of the question, for on the right hand of the intimidated civic magistrate sat the Lord Chancellor, on his left the Duke of Suffolk. The Lord Privy Seal, the Earls of Sussex and Hertford, with others of the council, also sat as judges that day. By those great state officers of the crown, some of whom had previously presided while the prisoners were questioned by torture, Durham and Culpeper were adjudged guilty and condemned to the dreadful death decreed to traitors. But though this sentence was pronounced, no proof of the crime of which they were accused had been established, and as it was considered necessary to substantiate the charge against the queen, they were respited for a few days, not in mercy, but that they might be subjected to fresh examinations by torture. They bore the extremity of their sufferings from day to day, if not unshrinkingly, without permitting anything that could criminate the queen to be wrung from the weakness of exhausted nature. Culpeper maintained the innocence of his royal kinswoman to the last unswervingly, nor could the extremity of torture draw from Durham an admission that the slightest criminality had passed between himself and Catherine since her marriage with the king. Damport, his friend, was subject to the torture of having his teeth forced out in the brakes, an instrument supposed to be the same as that called the Duke of Exeter's daughter. Worn out with his sufferings, Damport at length desired to speak to one of the council, and he would make confession. The report of the two gentlemen to whom his admissions were made is as follows. I, Sir John Gage, and I, Sir Richard Rich, went to him, and his saying for that time was, that Durham once said to him, when the king favoured Mistress Catherine, I could be sure of Mistress Catherine Howard, and if I would, but I dare not, the king beginneth to love her, but an he were dead, I might marry her. Damport also confesseth that Durham told him that the Duchess of Norfolk once said to a gentlewoman in the queen's chamber, pointing to him, "This is he who fled away to Ireland for the queen's sake." Damport confesseth this now, but would not do it before, for any torture that he could be put to. We have resolved that both he and Durham should be seriously examined again this day of certain points. Durham maketh humble suit for the remission of some part of the extremity of his judgment, wherein we require you to know his majesty's pleasure. He denied these confessions of Damport. From Christ's Church, this Tuesday morning, December 6th. The council, by the king's direction, gave this reply to the query of the coadjutors of London. Touching Culpeper and Durham, if your lordships do think that ye have got as much out of Durham as can be had, that ye shall then, giving them some time that they may prepare themselves to God for the salvation of their souls, proceed to their execution. At Oatland, this present feast of the Conception of Our Lady. We think, writes Wriothesley again, we can get no more out of Durham than is already confessed. Therefore, unless we shall hear otherwise from the king's majesty, we have resolved that they shall suffer tomorrow, December 9th. This was followed by an order from the council in London to the council with the king, saying, though they thought the offence of Culpeper very heinous, they had given orders for him to be drawn to Tyburn, and there only to lose his head, according to his majesty's most gracious determination. Durham petitioned for some mitigation of his cruel sentence, but, when application was made to the king, the following was the reply. The king's majesty thinketh he deserveth no mercy at his hand, and therefore hath determined that he shall undergo the whole execution. On the following day, Durham and Culpeper were drawn to Tyburn. Culpeper, out of consideration of his noble connections, was beheaded. Durham was hanged and quartered, with the usual barbarous circumstances of a traitor's death. Both protested their innocence of the crime for which they suffered. The heads of both were placed on London Bridge. Wriothesley expresses an enthusiastic wish that everyone's faults who were accused might be totted on their own heads, and thus proceeds to sum up the malfactions of the Duchess of Norfolk in the following order. First, having knowledge of Catherine's dereliction, she did recommend her to his majesty, and afterwards was a mayon medium for her to extend favor, or rather to renew favor to Durham. And when Durham was taken and in the Tower for his treason, after the same was declared to her by the whole council, she did secretly break up 2 chests, and out of the same conveyed all such letters as might manifest her own knowledge of the affair. There is something peculiarly characteristic of the man in the zest with which Wriothesley enters into the proceedings against the unfortunate kindred of the Queen. Yesterday, he writes, we committed the Lord William Howard, his wife, and Anne Howard. The Lord William stood as stiff as his mother, and made himself most clear from all mistrust or suspicion. I did not much like his fashion. This letter is in confidence to his colleague, and affords shrewd signs of a conspiracy in the council against the Queen and her family. Why else should Wriothesley have disliked the appearance of fearless innocence in Lord William Howard, or felt uneasy at the probability of his clearing himself from the charge that was aimed at his life? As for his property, that was immediately sequestered, and strict inquiry made into the truth of a report that some of his lordship's stuff, or goods, had been thrown into the sea during the stormy passage of Lord William and his family from France. The loss was, however, confined to the mules and horses. The unfairness with which the trials of Lord William Howard and Damport were conducted was so great that the Master of the Rolls, the Attorney and Solicitor General, and 3 of the King's Council, the very persons who had taken the examinations, were brought as witnesses against the prisoners, in lieu of other evidence. The offense of Damport was simply that of being acquainted with the previous state of affairs between his friend Durham and the Queen before her marriage, which, instead of revealing to the king, he had tattled to his acquaintance. He was in the end subjected to the most horrible tortures to make him declare more than he knew. Had he known more, it would have been divulged, for he had not the faculty of keeping a secret. The council were greatly embarrassed what to do with the infant children of Lord William Howard, 4 in number, and those of Lady Bridgewater, who were thus rendered homeless, but at last they consigned them to the custody of Cranmer, of the Bishop of Durham, and of Lady Oxford, to be dealt with according to their own discretion and convenience. The members of the council in London, in one of their letters to the council with the king, express a fear, as the Duchess of Norfolk is old and testy, that she may die out of perversity, to defraud the king's highness of a confiscation of her goods. Therefore it will be most advisable that she, and all the other parties named in a former letter, may be indicted forthwith of misprision of treason, whereby the Parliament should have better grounds to confiscate their goods than if any of them chanced to die before the bill of attainder passed. Here then was a laudable attention to the contingencies of life and death for the benefit of the royal purse. Shades of Dudley and Epsom, hide your diminished heads, while the dealings of the council of the monarch, who brought ye to the scaffold for deeds of wrong and robbery, are unveiled. In a letter dated December 11th, his Majesty's council is advertised by the council in London that they have found the value of 2,000 marks in money and about 600 or 700 in plate belonging to the Duchess of Norfolk. The disgusting thirst for plunder, which is so marked a feature in the proceedings of the king and his council at this period, was further gratified on the 21st, when Southampton, Wriothesley, and Sadler triumphantly wrote to Henry to inform him that they had had another interview with the poor sick old duchess, who had voluntarily confessed where she had hid 800 pounds in money of her own property. On the news of this unexpected addition to their prey, they informed the aged captive that it was the king's gracious intention to spare her life. Whereupon she fell on her knees with uplifted hands, and went into such paroxysms of hysterical weeping that these gentlemen were sorely troubled to raise her up again. Henry certainly appears to have derived much consolation for his matrimonial mortifications from the rich spoils of plate, jewels, and money, which were torn from the kindred of his unhappy queen. Sir John Gorstick and John Skinner were appointed to go to Reigate to Lord William Howard's house, to take an inventory of all the money, jewels, goods, and chattels they should find there, and bring the same to the council. Mr. Secretary Wriothesley, Master Pollard, and Mr. Attorney were appointed to go to the Duchess of Norfolk's and Lord William's houses at Lambeth for the same purpose. Sir Richard Long and Sir Thomas Pope were sent on the like errand to the Lady Bridgewater's houses in Kent and Southwark. The Duchess of Norfolk's house at Horsham had been previously ransacked. Lady Rochford's house at Blickling in Norfolk was also put under sequestration. Mary Lassells was, by the desire of the council with the king, exempted from the indictment for misprision of treason, in which all the parties privy to the queen's early frailty were included. So low had the personal dignity of the sovereign fallen, that a feeling of gratitude was expressed in his majesty's name to this woman, because she did from the first opening of the matter to her brother seem to be sorry, and to lament that the king's majesty had married the queen. Great credit is given by the council to Mary Lassells for her good service in having revealed the matter, and also that she had refused to enter into the service of the queen. Beyond her own assertion, there is not the slightest evidence that she ever had the offering of doing this, and it was probably Catherine's neglect or forgetfulness of this woman that provoked her to the denouncement. It is impossible to overlook her enmity to the queen throughout, so end the friendships of vice. Damport, Mannix, and the Duchess of Norfolk's servants were found guilty of the crime of misprision of treason. They made pitiful supplication for mercy, and the punishment of death was remitted by the king. The new year opened dismally on the fallen queen, who was still confined to the 2 apartments hung with mean stuff that had been allotted to her in the desecrated abbey of Sion. Her reflections during the 2 dreary months she had worn away in this wintry prison may be imagined. They were months replete with every agony, shame, grief, remorse, and terrible suspense. On the 16th of January, 1542, the new parliament that was to decide the fate of the queen met at Westminster. Catherine had, indeed, received a promise that her life should be spared, but if, relying on the sacredness of that promise, she had fondly imagined the bitterness of death was past, she must have been more astounded when the bill for her attainder was brought into the House of Lords. She was without friends, counsellors, or money at this awful crisis. The only person who might have succoured her in her sore distress was her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, if he had been so disposed. This nobleman was one of the greatest men of the age. In point of naval, military, and diplomatic talents, he had no second. He was the premier peer of England, and his unbounded wealth enabled him to retain in his band of pensioners a little standing army of his own in defiance of all the royal edicts against feudal retainers. He had the power of rising up in the House of Lords and demanding that his niece, the Queen of England, should be allowed the privilege of an Englishwoman, a fair trial for the offences of which she had been accused by her enemies, and that, if guilty, she should be proved so by the law, and not treated as such on presumption only. But Catherine, probably, had offended her uncle by withdrawing herself from his political tutelage. Like her fair and reckless cousin, Anne Boleyn, she had spurned his trammels in the brief hour of her queenly pride, and when the day of her adversity arrived, he not only abandoned her to her fate, but ranged himself on the side of her enemies. We have seen how this duke treated Anne Boleyn at the time of her trial. His conduct to the unhappy Catherine, whom he had been partly the means of placing in a situation so full of peril, even to a woman of sound principles and approved conduct, appears scarcely less cruel and vindictive. It is impossible that feelings of personal apprehension could have elicited from the conqueror of Sir Andrew Barton and one of the victors of Flodden the expressions we find in the following extract of his letter to the king on the arrest of the members of his family who were involved in the disgrace of the queen. The Duke of Norfolk to Henry VIII. Most noble and gracious sovereign lord, yesterday came to my knowledge that mine ungracious mother-in-law, mine unhappy brother and his wife, with my lewd sister of Bridgewater, were committed to the Tower, which I, by long experience, knowing your accustomed equity and justice used to all your subjects, am sure is not done, but for some of their false and traitorous proceedings against your royal majesty, which revolving in my mind, with also the most abominable deeds done by two of my nieces against your highness, hath brought me into the greatest perplexity that ever poor wretch was in, fearing that your majesty, having so often and by so many of my kin been thus falsely and traitorously handled, might not only conceive a displeasure in your heart against me and all other of my kin, but also abhor in manner to hear speak of any of the same. Wherefore, most gracious sovereign lord, prostrate at your feet, most humbly I beseech your majesty to call to your remembrance that a great part of this matter has come to light by my declaration to your majesty, according to my bounded duty, of the words spoken to me by my mother-in-law, when your highness sent me to Lambeth to search Durham's coffers, without the which I think she had not further been examined, nor consequently her ungracious children, which my true proceedings towards your majesty being considered, and also the small love my two false traitorous nieces and my mother-in-law have borne unto me, doth put me in some hope that your highness will not conceive any displeasure in your most gentle heart against me, that God knoweth did never think thought which might be to your discontentation. This letter seems to throw some light on the hostility of the Duke of Norfolk to the unfortunate queens, his nieces. They had evidently espoused the cause of the old Duchess Agnes in the family feud, and her influence had probably been exerted both with Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard in crossing his political measures and lessening his credit at court. The bill for attainder of Catherine Howard, late Queen of England, Jane, Lady Rochford, Agnes Howard, Duchess of Norfolk, Anne, Countess of Bridgewater, Lord William Howard, Anne Howard, wife to the Queen's brother Henry, and some others, was read for the first time January 21st. On the 28th, the Lord Chancellor, feeling some misgivings as to the legality of bringing the Queen and so many noble ladies to the block without allowing the accused the opportunity of making the slightest defence, reminded the peers how much it concerned them all not to proceed too hastily with the bill for attainder of the Queen, and others, which had been yet only read once among them, bidding them remember that the Queen was no mean or private person, but a public and illustrious one. Therefore, her cause ought to be judged in a manner that should leave no room for suspicion of some latent quarrel, and that she had not liberty to clear herself, if perchance by reason or counsel she was able to do it. For this purpose he proposed that a deputation, as well as of the Commons as of the Lords, should go to the Queen, partly to tell her the cause of their coming, and partly, in order to help her womanish fears, to advise her to have the presence of mind sufficient to say anything to make her cause the better. He added that it was but just that a princess should be tried by equal laws with themselves, and expressed his assurance that it would be most acceptable to her most loving consort if the Queen could clear herself in this way, and in the meantime the bill against her was ordered to be suspended. This equitable proposition of the Lord Chancellor was disapproved and negatived by the Privy Council, by whom it was determined that no opportunity, however limited, should be granted to Catherine of either speaking in her own defence or impugning the testimony of the witnesses, on whose unsifted assertions she was to be brought to the block. Whatever the conduct of the Queen had been, she was in this instance the victim of the most unconstitutional despotism, and the presumption may be reasonably drawn, from the illegality and unfairness of the proceedings of the Privy Council, that the evidence against her could not have been substantiated if investigated according to the common forms of justice. On the 30th of January, the Lord Chancellor declared that the Council, disliking the message that was to be sent to the Queen, had thought of another way less objectionable, which was to petition the King that the Parliament might have leave to proceed to give judgment and finish the Queen's cause, that the event of that business might no longer be in doubt, that his Majesty would be pleased to pardon them, if by chance in speaking of the Queen they might offend against the statutes then in existence, that the attainder against Durham and Culpeper might be confirmed by the authority of Parliament, and that his Majesty would, out of regard to his own health, spare himself the pain of giving his assent in person to the bill of attainder, but allow it to pass by letters patent under his great seal. 7 days after, the 6th of February, the bill was, with brutal haste, hurried through both houses. On the 10th, the queen was conveyed by water from her doleful prison at Sion to the Tower of London, under the charge of the Duke of Suffolk, the Lord Privy Seal, and the Lord Great Chamberlain. No record has been preserved of the manner in which Katharine Howard received the announcement that she must prepare for this ominous change. It is possible that, till that moment, the elastic spirits of youth, and a fond reliance on Cranmer's promise, had preserved the hope that keeps alive despair. Those by whom she was guarded and attended on her last cold desolate voyage had been silent as to her deportment, and no page in history tells us whether Katharine Howard behaved with the proud firmness of a descendant of the Plantagenets, or betrayed the passionate grief and terror of a trembling woman, when the portentous arch of the Traitor's Gate overshadowed her devoted head. With the length of the voyage and the season of the year, it is probable that darkness must have closed over the wintry waters of the Thames before the forlorn captive arrived at her destination, exhausted with fatigue and benumbed with cold. If this were the case, she was spared the horror of beholding the heads of her seducer, Derham, and her unfortunate cousin, Thomas Culpeper, over the bridge. One night of suspense was passed by Katharine in her new prison lodging before her fate was sealed. How that interval was spent is unrecorded. End of section 23. Section 24 of Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 4, by Agnes and Elizabeth Strickland. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anne Boulay. Katharine Howard, Chapter 2, Part 3. Henry gave his assent to the bill of attainder against his young, beautiful, and once adored consort, Katharine Howard, the Lady Rochford, Thomas Culpeper, and Francis Derham, the next day. The severed heads of these gentlemen had been, for the last 2 months, withering on London Bridge, so to them the sentence was immaterial. Notwithstanding the deceitful assurances of the royal grace that had been held out to the aged Duchess of Norfolk by Wriothesley, for the purpose of beguiling her, if possible, into becoming a witness against her granddaughter, the Queen, she was included in the act of attainder, for Henry was resolutely bent on taking her life. He maintained that the offence of breaking open Derham's coffers and destroying the papers she took from thence was sufficient evidence of the crime of high treason. The judges, compliant as they were in most cases, had in this instance ventured to dissent from his majesty, as it was impossible to ascertain of what nature those papers were. Henry was irritated at the opinion of his law officers, and said, that there was as much reason to convict the Duchess of Norfolk of treason as there had been to convict Derham. They cannot say, he observes, that they have any learning to maintain that they have a better ground to make Derham's case treason, and to suppose that his coming again to the Queen's service was to an ill intent of the renovation of his former naughty life, than they have in this case to presume that the breaking open of the coffers was to the intent to conceal letters of treason. Thus we learn from the highest possible authority that Derham suffered on presumptive evidence only, not that he had wronged the sovereign, but that he had conceived an intention to do so. This appears, in fact, to be the state rule of the case with regard to Derham. The Lord Chancellor produced the bill with the royal seal and the king's sign manual in the House of Lords, and desired the Commons might attend. The king was not present. The Duke of Suffolk then rose and stated that he and his fellow deputies had been with the Queen, and that she had openly confessed to them the great crime of which she had been guilty against the Most High God and a kind prince, and lastly against the whole English nation, that she begged of them all to implore his majesty not to impute her crime to her whole kindred and family, but that his majesty would extend his unbounded mercy and benevolence to all her brothers, that they might not suffer for her faults. Lastly, she besought his majesty that it would please him to bestow some of her clothes on those maidservants who had been with her from the time of her marriage, since she had now nothing else left, to recompense them as they deserved. The Earl of Southampton next rose up and confirmed what the Duke said, but added something that had been obliterated from the journals of that day's proceedings, which, it is conjectured, was done to prevent posterity from learning some facts connected with the fate of the Howard Queen. When the Commons entered, the assent of the King to the bill was given by commission, and the fatal sentence, "Les voix, les vues," was pronounced to the act which deprived a Queen of England of her life without trial, and loaded her memory with obloquies so dark a hue that no historian has ventured to raise the veil, even to inquire how far the charges are based on fact. The persons who went with the Duke of Suffolk to receive the confession of the Queen were those by whom she had been first accused to the King, namely Cranmer, Southampton, Audley, and Thirlby. How much she confessed to them, says Burnet, is not clear, neither by the journal nor the Act of Parliament, which only says she confessed. If she had confessed the crime of adultery, there can be no doubt that the act of attainder would have been based on her own admission, instead of a presumption that it was her intention to commit that crime. The confession, mentioned in general terms by Suffolk, was evidently her penitent acknowledgment of her incontinence before her marriage with the King. No one, indeed, appears ever to have felt deeper contrition for the offences of her youth than this unhappy queen. When she was informed that she must prepare for death, she addressed her confessor, Dr. Longland, Bishop of Lincoln, in these words, which were afterwards delivered by him to a noble young lord of her name and near alliance. As to the act, my reverend lord, for which I stand condemned, God and his holy angels I take to witness, upon my soul's salvation, that I die guiltless, never having so abused my sovereign's bed. What other sins and follies of youth I have committed I will not excuse, but I am assured that for them God hath brought this punishment upon me, and will, in his mercy, remit them, for which, I pray you, pray with me unto his Son and my Saviour, Christ. Cranmer had humanely tried, by every means in his power, to induce Catherine to preserve her life by acknowledging a pre-contract with Francis Derham. But she repelled the idea with scorn, and, with the characteristic firmness of a Howard, determined rather to go to the block as Queen of England than to prolong her dishonoured existence on the terms suggested. The Church of Rome allowed no divorce except in cases of pre-contract, and, as Catherine would not admit that she was troth-plight to Francis Derham, there was no other mode of severing Henry's matrimonial engagement with her than by the acts of the executioner. The only person against whom she testified resentment was her uncle Norfolk, who, in a letter to the council, written when he, in his turn, lay under sentence of death in the Tower, thus expresses himself of her and Anne Boleyn. What malice both my nieces that it pleased the king's highness to marry did bear unto me is not unknown to such ladies as kept them in this house, as my lady Herbert, my lady Tyrwhitt, my lady Kingston, and others, which heard what they said of me. In the same letter, the Duke shows sufficient cause for the indignation expressed by the unhappy Catherine against him, for his unmanly conduct to the unfortunate ladies of his family in their distress, since he boasts that he was the principal witness against the poor old Duchess, his father's widow, saying, "Who showed his majesty the words of my mother-in-law, for which she was attainted of misprision, but only I?" Catherine, when she vented the natural feelings of contempt and bitterness against her cruel uncle, had every reason to believe that her aged grandmother would follow her to the block, as she then lay under sentence of death in the Tower. Who can wonder that she regarded Norfolk with horror? The interval allowed to the unqueen Catherine Howard between her condemnation and the execution of her sentence was brief. More time to prepare for the awful change from life to eternity would have been granted to the lowest criminal who should have been found guilty by the laws of his country than was allotted to her who had shared the throne of the sovereign. The royal assent to her attainder was signified to her February 11th, but 2 days after she was led to the scaffold, accompanied by Lady Rochford and attended by her confessor. But Katharine Howard, though still in the morning of life and the bloom of beauty, was already weaned from the world. She had proved the vanity of all its delusions and the deceitfulness of royal favour. She had been more sternly dealt with by historians than Anne Boleyn, but she met her fate with more calmness, and a far greater degree of pious resignation. Familiarized as the people now were with the sight of blood, observes Tytler, it was not without some feelings of national abasement that they beheld another queen ignominiously led to the scaffold. And that, we may add, to die, not according to the law, but in defiance of the laws of England, which have provided, for the security of human life, that no one should be put to death without a fair and open trial. Frivolous as were the evidences on which Anne Boleyn was condemned, she was allowed the privilege of speaking for herself. Her wit, her acuteness, and impassioned eloquence, if heard with callous indifference by her partial judges, have pleaded her cause to all posterity. They plead for her still. Katharine Howard was led like a sheep to the slaughter, without being permitted to unclose her lips in her own defence, save for her spiritual adviser, who was to receive her last confession. This prelate, be it remembered, was also the king's confessor, the same whom he had required upon All Saints' Day to unite with him in thanking God for having blessed him with such a wife. More sympathy would in all probability have been manifested for the young, the beautiful, and deeply penitent queen, if she had had any other companion on the scaffold than the infamous Lady Rochford, whose conduct in regard to her accomplished husband and Anne Boleyn had rendered her an object of general execration. Katharine Howard submitted to the headsman's stroke with meekness and courage, and her more guilty companion imitated her humility and piety in the closing scene of their fearful tragedy. The particulars, as described in a contemporary letter from an eye-witness, are as follows. Otwell Johnson to his brother, John Johnson, merchant of the Staple at Calais, at London, 15th of February, 1541-42. From Calais I have heard as yet nothing of your suit to my Lord Grey, and for news from hence, I saw the Queen and the Lady Rochford suffer within the Tower the day following my letter on Sunday evening, whose souls, I doubt not, be with God, for they made the most godly and Christian end that ever was heard tell of, I think, since the world's creation, uttering their lively faith in the blood of Christ only, and with godly words and steadfast countenances, they desired all Christian people to take regard unto their worthy and just punishment of death for their offences against God heinously, from their youth upwards, and also against the King's royal majesty very dangerously, wherefore they being justly condemned, as they said, by the laws of the realm and parliament, required the people, I say, to take example at them, for amendment of ungodly lives, and to gladly obey the king in all things, for whose preservation they did heartily pray, and willed all people so to do, commending their souls to God, and earnestly calling upon him for mercy, whom I beseech to give us such grace, with faith, hope, and charity, at our departing out of this miserable world, to come to the fruition of his Godhead in joy everlasting. Amen. Your loving brother, Otwell Johnson. With my hearty commendations unto Mr. Cave and Mrs. Cave, not forgetting my sister your wife, I pray you to let them be made partakers of this last news, for surely it is well worth the knowledge. That doubts were entertained of the guilt of this unhappy queen may be gathered from the misgivings of the Lord Chancellor after the first reading of the bill for her attainder, and also from the following contemporary notice among the Lambeth manuscripts. This day, February 13th, was executed Queen Catherine for many shocking misdemeanours, though some do suppose her to be innocent. The last words of Lady Rochford were, that she supposed God had permitted her to suffer this shameful doom as a punishment for having contributed to her husband's death by her false accusation of Queen Anne Boleyn, but she was guilty of no other crime. This declaration was made on the scaffold, probably after she had seen the head of her royal mistress severed by the axe of the executioner. If urged by conscience at that dreadful moment to acknowledge the guilt of perjury and murder, she would scarcely have marred her dying confession by falsely protesting her innocence of the more venial offences for which she had been sentenced to die with the queen. The scaffold on which Katharine Howard and Lady Rochford suffered was the same on which Anne Boleyn, Lord Rochford, the Marquess of Exeter, and the venerable Countess of Salisbury had been previously executed. It was erected within the Tower, on the space before the church of St. Peter ad Vincula. It has been long since removed, but its site may still be traced by the indelible stains on the flints, which faintly map out the dimensions of the fatal spot where so much royal and noble blood was spilt by the headsman's axe during the Tudor reigns of terror. Thus died in the flower of her age, and in the 18th month of her marriage, Queen Katharine Howard, the 5th wife of Henry VIII, and the second queen whom he had sent to the block, after repudiating a lawful wife to obtain her hand. In both instances it might be said, the beauteous toy, so fiercely sought, had lost its charms by being caught. Henry's motives for marrying Katharine Howard are explained in a letter from the Privy Council to Mr. Paget, his ambassador in France, in the following words. It pleased his highness, upon a notable appearance of honour, cleanness, and maidenly behaviour, to bend his affection towards Mrs. Katharine Howard, daughter to the Lord Edmund Howard, brother to me, the Duke of Norfolk, insomuch that his highness was finally contented to honour her with his marriage, thinking now in his old age, after sundry troubles of mind which had happened unto him by marriages, to have obtained such a perfect jewel of womanhood, and very perfect love to him, as should have not only been to his quietness, but also brought forth the desired fruit of marriage, like as the whole realm thought semblable, and did her all honour accordingly. In the act of settlement of the succession, the imaginary children, which Henry expected his fair young consort to bring him, were given the preference to his disinherited daughters by his 2 first queens. Katharine Howard, like her cousin Anne Boleyn, probably fared the worse for not having fulfilled the royal tyrant's wish of male offspring. Give me children or die, appears to have been the fearful alternative offered by Henry to his queens. Henry VIII assumed the title of King of Ireland a few days before the execution of his 5th consort. Katharine Howard therefore died the first Queen of England and Ireland. The mangled form of the once adored Katharine Howard was borne from the bloody scaffold to a dishonoured grave with indecent haste, and with no more regard to funereal obsequies than had been vouchsafed to her equally unfortunate cousin, the murdered Anne Boleyn, near whose ostensible place of burial her remains were interred. Weaver gives the following record of her grave. In St. Peter's chapel of the Tower, very near the relics of Anne Boleyn, lieth the interred body of Katharine, the 5th wife of Henry VIII, the daughter of Edmund, and niece to Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk. It is verily believed, and many strong reasons are given both by English and foreign writers, that neither this Queen Katharine nor Queen Anne were any way guilty of the breach of matrimony whereof they were accused. If all the patterns of a merciless tyrant had been lost to the world, says Sir Walter Raleigh, when speaking of Henry VIII, they might have been found in this prince. Henry VIII was the first king of England who brought ladies to the block, who caused the tender female form to be distorted with tortures and committed a living prey to the flames. He was the only king who sought consolation for the imagined offences of his wives against his honour by plundering their relatives of their plate and money. Shame, not humanity, prevented him from staining the scaffold with the blood of the aged Duchess of Norfolk. He released her after long imprisonment. George Cavendish introduces the sorrowful shade of the unfortunate Howard Queen among his metrical visions. A few lines may bear quotation. As written by her contemporary, they are very curious. Thus as I sat, the tears within my eyne, of her the wrecked, whiles I did debate, before my face methought I saw this queen, no whit, as her I left, God wot, of late. But all bewept, in black and poor estate, which prayed me that I would ne forget the fall of her within my book to set. Notwithstanding the rudeness of the measure, there is something very pathetic in the piteous imagery of the fallen queen, all bewept, in black and poor estate, petitioning for her place in the melancholy train of contemporary victims of the shadowy dramatis persona of George Cavendish's book is made up. She is not much beholden to his report after all, for he violates history by making her confess that which she denied before God and his holy angels, namely, violation of her marriage vows. Cavendish speaks of her as very young and extols her great beauty, which he makes her lament as the occasion of her fall. To be a queen fortune did me prefer, flourishing in youth with beauty fresh and pure, whom nature made shine equal with the stars, and to reign in felicity with joy and pleasure, wanting no thing that love might me procure, so much far beloved, far beyond the rest, with my sovereign lord, who lodged me in his nest. Our poet makes the young queen bewail her loss of the royal obsequies, and that no one would wear mourning for her in the following quaint lines. Now I know well, quod she, among my friends all, that here I left the day of my decay, that I shall get no pompous funeral, nor of my black no man the charge shall pay, save that some one perchance may hap to say, such one there was, alas, and that there was Ruth, pity, that she herself disdained with such untruth. Culpeper is also compelled by our poet to make a ghostly confession of a crime there is no evidence to believe he ever committed, and which he denied on the rack and on the scaffold. It is, however, to be observed that Cavendish makes all Henry's victims suffer justly, except the Countess of Salisbury, though the view he has taken of both Catherine Howard and her predecessor, Anne Boleyn, is afterwards contradicted very fully by the admission he describes Henry as making in the midst of his deathbed remorse. After I forsook my first most lawful wife, and took another, my pleasure to fulfill, I changed often, so inconstant was my life. Death was the meed of some that did none ill, which only was to satisfy my will, I was so desirous of new. A high tribute to the virtues of Henry's first queen, Catherine of Aragon, follows. It was in consequence of the discovery of Catherine Howard's early misconduct that the memorable Act of Parliament was passed, making it high treason for any person to know of a flaw in the character of any lady whom the king might propose to marry without revealing it, and also subjecting the lady to the penalty of death if she presumed to deceive her sovereign on that point. Nicander Nucius, a Greek attaché of the imperial ambassador at the court of Henry VIII in the year 1546, tells us that Catherine Howard, whom he places as the fourth instead of the fifth in his catalogue of Henry's wives, was esteemed the most beautiful woman of her time. He records her tragic fate, but has so little idea of the real state of the facts that he says, she had fallen in love with a noble youth of the court, and the king himself detected their guilt, and commanded their heads to be cut off with those who were the accessories to their passion, and the heads, except that of the queen, he caused to be elevated on spears, and fixed on one of the turrets of the bridge, and the skulls are even at this time to be seen denuded of flesh. A strange confusion of truth and falsehood pervades this statement, but it is curious, because from the pen of a contemporary, and denoting the precise spot occupied by the heads of Culpeper and Durham. These Nicander had himself seen. His ignorance of the English language caused him to make a few mistakes in the history attached to these ghastly relics of the royal matrimonial tragedy which occurred in 1541–42. End of section 24. End of Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 4, by Agnes and Elizabeth Strickland.